Well, greetings to everyone. If you have a Bible with you today, I invite you to open it up and join me now in Psalm number 128. Today we are resuming our study in the Psalms of Ascent that go from Psalm number 120 to Psalm number 134. Last week we had Tanner Hansen as our special guest speaker. This was the first time that he had ever spoken on a Sunday morning, either before a live audience or certainly his first time to record a sermon for those of you who are watching online. So I thought he did very well, and I hope that you were blessed by that. But today we are resuming this study here in the Psalms, and I just want to begin by reading Psalm number 128 with you. If your Bible's open, read it together with me. Blessed are all who fear the Lord and who walk in his ways. You will eat the fruit of your labor. Blessings and prosperity will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table. Thus is the man blessed who fears the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion all the days of your life. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem, and may you live to see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. And let me add to that, peace be upon the church. Last week, as Tanner shared his first Sunday morning sermon with us, he talked with us a little bit about his own struggle with prayer. And I appreciated that he was open and honest with us about that, because I'm quite confident that if I were to survey all the members of the congregation and ask if you too struggle with prayer, I'm pretty confident everyone would say yes, including yours truly. So I appreciated that he was willing to be honest and vulnerable with us about that. As Tanner shared his struggle with us, he quoted several different people on the subject of prayer. I hope that you noticed that he dropped my name in there with some of the greats. You know, college students are poor and easily influenced, and so I'll have you know, it doesn't take much money at all to kind of get my name dropped in there with greats like C.S. Lewis. But beyond mentioning me and also C.S. Lewis, he also had a quote from Dallas Willard, who happens to be one of my favorite writers on the spiritual life. And I would actually like to begin by sharing today something with you that I once learned by reading Dallas Willard. One of the more infamous sayings of Jesus in his ministry was his teaching that a person must count the cost if he or she is going to become his disciple. At the end of Luke chapter 14, Jesus gives the following two examples. He says, if a person wants to build a tower, will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? If he lays the foundation and then is unable to complete it, everyone will ridicule him. Or, Jesus goes on to say, suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one who is coming against him with 20,000? Well, the answer to both of these is, of course that's what they'll do. It would be silly to do anything otherwise. In the same way, if someone wants to become a disciple of Jesus Christ, they must count the cost. There is a cost to following Christ, and at first, the cost can seem very steep. But this is where Dallas Willard brings in a very important concept that I don't know that I'd ever considered before. If it is true that one must count the cost to become a disciple of Jesus, it is also true, he says, that one must count the cost if you decide not to become a follower of Jesus. Now, you might ask here, what does he mean by that? The point that Dallas is making is that by choosing not to follow Jesus, one actually pays a very steep price. Now, it is true that in the short term, choosing a life of sin can have great pleasure to it. It is the path of least resistance at first, and it can be fun and exciting and even give life a certain amount of exhilaration. But you have probably noticed for those who do give themselves to this kind of life, you don't find very many old people who are happy with this. You don't find very many people who found fulfillment in this way of life. What you do usually find is anger, bitterness, resentment, loneliness, isolation, and quite often, despair. The point that Dallas is making is there is a cost to following Jesus. But the cost that is paid early on is a cost that is paid toward the movement of joy. Eventually, that cost is going to be paid back tenfold. If not now, then certainly in the hereafter. But for those who do not choose to be a disciple of Christ, they pay an even steeper price. The price may not be paid up front, but make no mistake about it, the price is ultimately paid, and the price is steep. What we have here in our psalm today is a poetic declaration from a man who has counted the cost and found that the happiest life available is the life of the fear of the Lord. Now, when we say fear, we don't mean trembling or hiding in the corner, okay? That may be appropriate every now and again. But the kind of fear that we are talking about is the kind of fear that might best be described as awe or wonder. It is the life that takes God seriously for who He is and who stands in wonder that the God of all of creation wants to be intimately involved in our life. The idea of the fear of the Lord brackets the two sections of our psalm today. First, in verse 1, blessed are those who fear the Lord, who walk in His ways. And then again in verse 4, thus is the man blessed who fears the Lord. In other words, according to the psalmist, the truest life, the happiest life, is the life of one who fears the Lord. As I was thinking about this psalm last week, my mind went back once again to Solomon. Now, we don't know who wrote this particular psalm, but if you'll remember back to our last study 2 weeks ago, we looked at Psalm 127, and we saw the tradition has attributed that particular psalm to Solomon. We noted then that we don't usually associate the Psalms with Solomon. Usually, if anybody, we associate it with his father, David. But tradition attributed that particular psalm to Solomon, and as I read our psalm this week, number 128, my mind once again went back to Solomon. Now, we have no indication that Psalm 128 was written by Solomon, nor would I assert that that is the case. But the theme of the psalm does resonate with something that Solomon is associated with in the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. Someday I hope to study the book of Ecclesiastes with you. It is one of my favorite books. As a matter of fact, it is the first book that I tried to teach. It was for a college class in my home congregation back in Missouri, and I can assure you I completely butchered the class. After all, Ecclesiastes is about wisdom, and I was 18 years old at the time, and what does an 18-year-old know about wisdom? Okay? For that matter, 20 years later, what does a 38-year-old know about wisdom? More than I knew at 18, certainly, but I'm well aware, more aware than ever, that I don't know much at all, that I still have a lot to learn. True though that may be, Ecclesiastes is a book about searching for the meaning of life. And Solomon takes up the task of trying to find meaning in life. And he does this by giving himself to every sort of pursuit. He tries to pursue wealth. He tries to pursue pleasure. He tries to pursue power. He even tries to pursue worldly wisdom. And after he has given himself to the pursuer of all of these things, what is the conclusion that he comes to? Meaningless, meaningless, my NIV Bible puts it. Everything is meaningless. Listen to some of the ways that he says this throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 1 and verse 12. I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Chapter 2 and verse 1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Chapter 2 and verse 17. So I hated life because of the work that is done under the sun. It was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things that I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. And yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil into which I have poured all my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Chapter 5 and verse 10. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This, too, is meaningless. We could go on from there, but by now, I'm sure you get the point. Now, this might leave you with the impression that the book of Ecclesiastes is an incredibly hopeless book. After all, if the wisest man who ever lived, a man who was supernaturally endowed with wisdom by God, felt like all was meaningless, what hope is there that we might find meaning in life? But despite this very negative refrain that repeats itself throughout the book, there is also a counter refrain that builds momentum as the book goes along. While all earthly pursuits ultimately lead to the conclusion that it is meaningless in and of itself, there is another point to be heard. This too is sprinkled throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. A person can do nothing better than to eat and to drink and to find satisfaction in their own toil. This, too, I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who could eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and happiness. Chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. This is what I observe to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat and to drink and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life that God has given them, for this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot in life and be happy in their toil, this is the gift of God. But the grand conclusion comes at the very end of the book. At the end of chapter 12, after every pursuit has been followed, every philosophy has been tried out, here is how the book ends. Now that all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. the conclusion that Solomon comes to at the end of his great book of wisdom is exactly what we see put forward in our psalm today. The happiness of men and women is found in only one place: the fear of the Lord. Now, it is interesting that as we look further at this psalm, there is a particular picture given of what a happy and blessed life by God looks like. And in the picture of Psalm 128, happiness is cast in the form of a family. The family is prosperous. They enjoy the fruit of their own labor. The man's wife is to be like a fruitful vine in his house. His children are like olive shoots that grow up around his table. It is the picture of a joyous and happy home. However, a question we might ask here is that what a happy life must look like? And it should be obvious right away that that can't be so. After all, who was more blessed than Jesus, and he didn't have a wife or children? Who lived in more fear of the Lord than Paul, but he didn't have a wife and children? No, the picture here is one of a common Near Eastern perception of what a blessed life looks like. Remember, God promised Israel he would bless their families in such ways if they feared and obeyed him. But as with many things in the Old Testament, the picture is meant to point to something beyond itself. First of all, let's let the picture be true where it is true. For the majority of people, the way of marriage and family is the way of blessedness and happiness. God has ordained that to be so because the family is the foundation of all societal stability and happiness. So it is a good and blessed thing when the Lord blesses a family and a household. But there is a greater significance. Whether or not we as individuals get to experience the deep joys of marriage and family in this life, there is a marriage that is yet to come that all of God's people will experience. It is the union of Christ with his bride, the church. That is what you and I were ultimately made for. It is where you and I will find our ultimate fulfillment and joy. God's intention is to eventually marry his people, to draw them into full union with him, so that when all is said and done, the blessings of family in the Lord will cover the new heavens and earth as far as the east is from the west. You know, every once in a while, you all receive a text or a phone call from me letting you know that I'll be praying for you the next day. And I do that so that you might have the opportunity to share with me some of the things that might be of concern for you, and so that I might know some specific things to pray for on your behalf. But whether you respond to that or not, or have anything specific for me to pray for, there is always one thing that I pray for each and every one of you every time that I pray. I pray that God would draw you into ever greater union with himself, and that more and more you would be enabled to participate in the divine nature. Because, church, that is ultimately the only way we will become blessed or happy in the Lord. Our life is meant to be drawn into union with him. And whether or not our individual lives ever fit into that ancient Near Eastern picture of family happiness in this psalm, one thing is for certain. We will all be sons and daughters around God's table one day, thriving like olive shoots. And when we take our place at that eternal table, finally finding our full union with God, nothing will keep us from being called the blessed of the Lord. May God bless you this week.